American Top 40.
A successful English band called The Pretenders debut this week with their first American hit, which is kind of nice because their leader and lead singer, Chrissie Hynde, is an American girl from Akron, Ohio. The Pretenders, they come in at 33 with Brass in Pocket.
Got brass in pocket.
The Pretenders, in their first chart single on American Top 40, it went to number 1 in England. At number 33, it debuts on American Top 40, and it's called Brass in Pocket. 32 hits to number 1 and counting down.
Casey's Coast to Coast.
Well, now we're up to the popular group that went from triumph to tragedy in just a matter of days. They're the English group The Pretenders, whose lead singer is American Chrissie Hynde. In 1980, they released their debut album, the LP titled The Pretenders, and it hit the top 10 here and generated a single that hit number 1 in England and number 14 in America, Brass in Pocket. In late 1981, they released their second album, Pretenders 2. It also made the top 10 and featured British and American hit singles. Everywhere they played, the Pretenders were selling out concert halls. Their star was definitely rising. Then, last summer, trouble began. Bass player Pete Farndon began to disagree on creative matters with the other 3 members. They told him if he couldn't come around to their way of thinking, they'd have to fire him. Pete said fine, and he quit. Then, 2 days later, a tragedy. Guitarist James Honeyman Scott died in a drug-related incident. Chrissie Hynde and drummer Martin Chambers were distraught and in shock. The Pretenders were finished. But Martin Chambers told us, with the support of our producer, Chris Thomas, and the support of fans around the world who wrote and called us, Chrissie and I made the decision to continue. The best thing we could do was get on with something and throw ourselves into it. End of quote. Well, with the help of some British friends, studio musicians, Chrissie and Martin recorded their current single. And just a few weeks ago, 2 new members joined the Pretenders, guitarist Robbie McIntosh and bass player Malcolm Foster. At number 19, here's Back on the Chaingang, The Pretenders. The Pretenders move up 3 notches to number 19, their 4th week on the chart on American Top 40 with Back on the Chaingang. And the countdown rolls on.
Casey's Coast to Coast. Coast to Coast.
We're counting down to the hot British band whose American lead singer left her hometown when she was 22 years old. She vowed she'd never return until she made it. 7 years later, she returned home. Her story coming up.
Casey's Coast to Coast. American Top 40.
Now we're up to the current hit by the British band whose American lead singer left home, vowing she wouldn't return until she made it. Her hometown is Akron, Ohio. And back in 1973, when she was 22 years old, this singer and songwriter told her mother and father that she was leaving Akron for England, where she intended to become a successful performer. And they wouldn't see her again until she was. Her parents tried to change her mind, but she was stubborn, and she left for England. For 7 long years, she lived in London working at her career. She sang with many bands, both in England and France. She even took a job as a music critic in the hope of meeting working musicians. Finally, after a lot of frustration and bad breaks, she became part of a new band that formed in 1978. They had a few British hits, which finally led to an American recording contract with Sire Records. Then, in 1980, they hit number 1 in England with a song that became their first top 40 here in the USA. The number 14 hit, Brass in Pocket. And that same year, in Akron, Ohio, 7 years after their daughter, Chrissie, had left home, Melville and Dolores Hynde found themselves sitting in Cleveland's Agora Auditorium. They were watching their daughter make good on that promise to come home a star. With her third top 40 hit, here is Chrissie Hynde and the Pretenders at number 37 this week on American Top 40 with Middle of the Road. Falling from 24 to 37 on American Top 40, Chrissie Hynde and the Pretenders with Middle of the Road as the countdown continues.
American Top 40, Top 40.
I'm Casey Kasem. Now we're up to our story of romance on the record charts. This is the story of a woman who is now a rock star, but who 15 years ago was a teenage rock and roll fan growing up in Akron, Ohio. And that's when she became infatuated with the leader of the Kinks, Ray Davies. The Kinks' debut album was one of the first records she ever bought, but the thought of ever actually meeting Ray Davies was only a dream. Fade out and fade in several years later in the early 70s. The young woman had moved to London and was writing for the New Musical Express. And as a rock critic, she wrote about her favorite rock star. For example, she once wrote, "Raymond Douglas Davies is the only songwriter I can think of who can write such personal material and never get embarrassing. One of the true romantics of our time." End of quote. Well, a few years later, this young female critic had formed her own band. And the first song they recorded was an old Kinks song written by Ray Davies called "Stop Your Sobbing." Finally, in 1980, she and Ray Davies met in person. And it was love at first sight for both of them. Her romantic teenage dream had come true. And for nearly 4 years now, Ray Davies of the Kinks and Chrissie Hynde of the Pretenders have been a couple. Chrissie recently told Rolling Stone magazine, "Life is never what you think it's going to be." This week, Ray Davies' girlfriend is in our countdown with her band's latest hit. At number 29, Chrissie Hynde and the Pretenders with "Show Me."
Show me the meaning of love.
The Pretenders on American Top 40 at number 29 again this week with their fourth Top 40 hit.
The hits from coast to coast.
This is AT40, I'm Casey Kasem. Now we're up to one of only 2 pop music critics that we know of who became pop stars. It's often been said that a critic is a frustrated performer. Now, if that's true, 2 former critics took their frustrations right into the top 10. One is a former writer for the English music magazine Smash Hits. He was doing that job in the early 1980s, and then he became a Pet Shop Boy. He's Neil Tennant. The other former pop critic turned pop star is an American woman from Akron, Ohio, and she also wrote for an English music publication. In the early 70s, she'd left Ohio for England. That was the home of her favorite rock and roll bands, and she wanted to become a singer. Once she hit London, she stepped right into the social swing of the music scene. And one night at a party, she was loudly expressing her opinion about music that she liked and about music that she disliked. She was overheard by a writer from the popular London music paper, The New Musical Express, and he was impressed enough to introduce the brash, opinionated young woman to one of his editors. Well, the editor said to her, "Put your typewriter where your mouth is." And the career of Chrissie Hynde as a pop music critic was off and running. She wrote for the New Musical Express for about a year and became known for her witty and often caustic reviews. Well, a lot of that sharp-witted style turned up in her songwriting as well, when just a few years later, Chrissie Hynde formed her own rock and roll band, The Pretenders. This week, former rock critic Chrissie Hynde and The Pretenders are in our countdown with their 5th Top 40 hit. At number 16, here's "Don't Get Me Wrong."
Don't get me wrong.
Don't get me wrong. If I come and go like fashion, I might be great tomorrow, but hopeless yesterday. Chrissie Hynde and the Pretenders on AT40, up 3 notches to number 16 as the countdown rocks on.
Casey's biggest hits.
14 years ago this week, back in 1984, one of the biggest hits in the USA was by a singer who learned the hard way that people take what she says seriously. It was back in 1989 that longtime vegetarian Chrissie Hynde was at a conference on animal issues in London. At one point, a reporter asked Chrissie what she'd do to keep people from eating meat. As an offhand joke, she said, "Well, we could begin by burning down all the hamburger stands." The very next day, a fan of Chrissie's did just that, torching a hamburger stand in a London suburb. Chrissie Hynde had to go on television that night to tell people she wasn't being serious and that burning down fast food restaurants is not the way to go. And she learned an important lesson. Being flip may be fun, but sometimes people take you seriously, and the results can be tragic. 14 years ago this week, Chrissie and her band, The Pretenders, had one of the biggest hits in the USA. Here's "Middle of the Road."
Middle of the road.
From 14 years ago, The Pretenders and Middle of the Road. I'm Casey Kasem.